Hello and welcome everyone to IT Pro Guide. Mohammed Nias with you. In this video, we're gonna see how to migrate your VMware virtual machines to Microsoft Azure using Azure Site Recovery. You're watching the fourth video in Azure Site Recovery video series. In the previous videos, we have discussed about Azure Site Recovery for migration, then a step-by-step demo on how to configure site-to-site VPN with Azure VNet and a FortiGate firewall in on-premises. In the previous video, we discussed and watched about Hyper-V VMs to Microsoft Azure. So in this video, we're gonna see how to move your virtual machines, how to migrate your virtual machines from VMware to Microsoft Azure. We're gonna brief to Azure Site Recovery in the beginning. Then we will walk through the architecture and a demo infrastructure of Azure Site Recovery migration demo, then a step-by-step demo to VMware virtual machines to Azure migration. So Azure Site Recovery for migration. Azure Site Recovery is for disaster recovery. It's a feature in Azure for disaster recovery, but you can use Azure Site Recovery for migration also. The difference is, in disaster recovery, you fail over to Azure and you have to fail back once you want to come back to the main site. But for migration, when you choose Azure Site Recovery for migration, you can only fail over to Microsoft Azure. You cannot fail back to on-premises. Azure Site Recovery can be used to migrate from on-premises physical server, Hyper-V, VMware, or Azure VMs between two different regions, or from AWS also. You can choose Azure Site Recovery for moving your workloads to Microsoft Azure. Look at the demo infrastructure. You can see we have a FortiGate firewall in on-premises and a VPN gateway in Azure Virtual Network. So there is a site-to-site VPN connectivity. Then we have a domain controller, which is a physical machine. We already replicated in the second video, so we have a secondary domain controller in Microsoft Azure. So any virtual machines now moved to Azure can authenticate from Azure Virtual Network itself, as it have a secondary domain controller. So in the previous video, what we have done, we installed the Azure Site Recovery Provider in Hyper-V, and this Azure Site Recovery Provider were managing the replication of virtual machines with Azure. So in Hyper-V, when it comes to VMware, what we're gonna do is we're gonna spin up a recovery service vault as we did in the previous video. Then we have to download and deploy a OVF file from Microsoft Azure, which actually it is a Windows server, but a pre-installed Azure Site Recovery Provider. So it will manage the replication of your virtual machine from on-premises to Microsoft Azure. So the only difference is, in VMware migration, you're going to deploy an OVF file and you're going to configure the configuration server in that virtual machine instead of installing it directly to the Hyper-V. That's the only difference here. So look at the architecture. What we have is we have a Azure subscription and an Azure storage account. Why Azure storage account? Because when you start replication of your virtual machines, the landing space of your virtual machine data is in Azure storage, and Azure Virtual Network is your private space, is your data center boundary in Azure. Then you have a configuration server. This is what we were talking about, like an OVF file you have to deploy in VMware, so that this configuration server will take care of the replication of your virtual machines from on-premises to Azure. Then you have to add your VMware servers, and then you can initiate the replication. And you can see that the mobility service, you don't need to install it in each virtual machines. That will be configuration server will do that part. You just need to deploy the configuration server and add your VMware servers. You can add vCenter, so that it will discover all the virtual machines in vCenter instead of adding the EXSI host one by one. Now look at the steps to be executed to complete your on-premises VMware virtual machines migration to Microsoft Azure. We're gonna walk through step-by-step demo on each of these steps. Before we begin, we need to do some configuration in virtual machines. The very important point is complete all pending updates. because if you miss any of this point, you will be able to migrate your virtual machine from on-premises to Azure, but you will find it hard to connect it to the virtual machines, because once we move your VMs, the way to connect is one with the console in Microsoft Azure. The other option is through RDP from your workstation, or you can remote desktop to the virtual machine from any other virtual machines running in the same network. So these are the options. So you have to prepare your virtual machine before you ship to Microsoft Azure by opening the RDP ports, by completing all pending updates, and allow remote desktop for the users who are planned to connect to Microsoft Azure virtual machines. Log into Microsoft Azure. Let's create virtual network. That is going to be your data center in your private space in Azure. So click on the virtual network, then click to create a new virtual network. Create a new resource group. A resource group is like a folder where you organize all your services in one resource group. So the scope of those resource group will be limited to that resource group. Then name your virtual network VNet Cloud, and select a region which is close to you or depends upon the available service. Click review to create. Before that, go to the IP addresses and make sure that the CIDR block doesn't conflict with your on-premises CIDR block, and you can add new subnet or you can edit the existing subnet. I'm going to modify the default one to protection subnet, something like that. You can create a web subnet, application subnet, database subnet, like that. You also need to have a test subnet or a test network, so that you can fail over the machines to test network, and you can do some testings, and then you can go for the planned failover, that means the live failover. So keep the other settings as it is and then complete the virtual network creation. So now the virtual network is ready. Let's create recovery vault. That is the service that we're going to use to move virtual machine. So go and select backup and site recovery. Now select the subscription, then select a resource group, the same resource group which we have created for the virtual network, then give a vault name, then click review and create. Review the summary settings, then click to create the recovery service vault. Now the recovery service vault has been deployed. Before we configure migration vault, let us download the OVF file, that is a configuration server which you have to deploy in VMware. The link to download this OVF file is available below in the description, or you can go to Microsoft Knowledge Base and download it. It is available as a OVA file, so it is easy to deploy it. You can download it directly from the Microsoft Download Center. It's almost 21 GB. It's actually a Windows server. You can deploy it in EXSI or from vCenter. I'm going to deploy it in EXSI. Click to create or register a virtual machine. Then deploy a virtual machine from an OVA template. Then give a meaningful name. Then select the OVA file from here, which we have just downloaded. And then click next. Then select the data store and select your virtual network. Then click next. Now it's ready to complete the deployment. Now you can see that the deployment is in progress. It's gonna take a few minutes to complete it. Once it complete the deployment, just open the console and create a password and username. Then log in with the new credentials. So you have to name this computer first. That is Windows VM, or you can name like configuration server also. So this is going to be registered with Azure. So now you have to enter the credentials of your Azure so that it can authenticate with the Microsoft Azure Active Directory. Let's sign in with the Azure credentials. Now I have completed the authentication and verification of this machine, this virtual machine, with Microsoft Azure using Azure credentials. Now you can see that the background configuration tasks has been performing, which is configuring the machine and also configuring the identity of server with the Azure Active Directory, setting up the certificates for configuration server. So more automations are there, you have less things to do. Now we need to reboot this server. So the initial configuration was to connect the configuration server with Azure. That has completed. In the next after reboot, we're going to configure the configure server again to discover the virtual machines with VMware vCenter. So let's wait the system to come back. Login back to the virtual machine after, we can say, configuration server after reboot. Once you come back, it will automatically open the Windows Internet Explorer and navigate to a HTTPS configuration page that will help you to configure and discover the virtual machines in VMware vCenter. Now the first step, you are connected to internet, that's fine. Then you have to select network connectivity with on-premises and with internet. I'm going to choose the same network for both, like for the connectivity with Azure and for the connectivity with the local network. And you can see that the port receiving replication traffic is 9443. You have to open appropriate port in the firewall. So that part, the connectivity part, has completed. The next one is to select the recovery vault. So you have to sign into Microsoft Azure so that the columns will be filled up with your subscription details. Now allow the required permissions. Now you can select the subscription, resource group and recovery service vault. Select the subscription, then resource group. Now you can see all the details from Azure has fetched up, and you can see it here, so you can just select it from the drop down list. Click to continue. Now install the third-party software. This is a MySQL community server. I have to install the MySQL. So you can accept it. Will download and install MySQL to your configuration server. So that part has completed. You can just click continue. Now the appliance configuration has been validating. It is recommended to have a static IP, as this is for a demonstration purpose. I'm not going to change it, but you have to go with a static IP. That is recommended. I'll just click yes and continue. Now the configuration of vCenter. You have to add your vCenter server here. Enter your vCenter server name or IP address, then port number remain 443. Then give a meaningful name for your vCenter server to identify it in Azure. Then a username and password. Then a friendly name for the credentials of your vCenter server. I'm going to give the fully qualified domain name, and you have to make sure that your configuration server can resolve this vCenter address. Now the vCenter details is there. Just click continue. Now you have to configure the virtual machine credentials so that it can access the virtual machine and copy your data from your servers. So select the operating system, then give a friendly name to the credentials to understand. So this will be this credentials will also be used to install the mobility agents into virtual machines. I don't have a Linux machine, so I skip that part. So let's finalize this configuration. Now the appliance has been successfully configured. Let's move to Microsoft Azure and start configuring Recovery Vault. The first thing we're going to do in the Recovery Vault is to prepare the infrastructure. For that, go to Site Recovery, then click on Prepare Infrastructure. So this migration is from on-premises to Microsoft Azure. We're going to perform migration and we have to select yes with VMware Hypervisor. Click OK. The protection goal is ready then. The deployment planner is not a part of scope of this video, so just click something, or if you want to really plan it, you will find a link in the description on how to do that. Just click OK. The configuration server here is Windows VM, then vCenter. So select it appropriately, then Resource Manager, VNet Cloud, then click OK. You have to create and associate a replication policy. Just click on Create and Associate. Give a meaningful name for the policy. If you want different policies, different settings for RPO, recovery point in hours, you can edit the values here. Now the infrastructure part has completed. Click OK and move to Replicate Application Step 1. Then select appropriate selections, then select the process server. Same as the configuration server, or configuration and process server are one here. Then click OK. Then select the subscription, then resource group, keep the deployment model as a resource manager. Then Azure network, select it, then select here the virtual network which we have created just before. Then select the subnet that you want to place the virtual machine. Then I have only one virtual machine, but the VMware tools has not yet installed, so I have to go and install the VMware tools. So let's do that. So once you complete the VMware tools installation, it's quite easy to install, so I'm not going to demonstrate it here. I have to come back to Microsoft Azure, then just go up and down with the selections. It will make a refresh, then you will find it enabled. Now you can see, you can select the VMware virtual machine. Now select the virtual machine, then click OK. So we have only one virtual machine here. Then configure the properties of this virtual machine. Select the disk type. You have three options. Then select the storage account. The storage accounts are already created, so if you don't have, you can create a storage account also. Then select the credential. You can see that I have different credentials. So the credentials for the instance, you have to select it here. Now the validation has completed. Let us associate the replication policy that we have created just before in the prepare infrastructure step. Then click OK and click on enable replication. This will initiate the replication. Now if you go and click on the enable replication progress button, you will see that the tasks and you can see like the status of replication tasks. Come back to the migration vault and click on replicated items. Under protected items, you will see the virtual machines status. You can see like the replication health is fine, and it has just started only. You will see the percentage of progress after some time. Now you can see that the replication has completed and the status has changed to protected. So let's do a test failover. Go and click on the test failover. This will fail over this virtual machine to a virtual network. You can have a separate virtual network for testing. I'm going to use the same network here. So select a recovery point that you need. Here I don't have too much RPOs available because we just completed the first sync. Select the virtual network, then click OK. Now the test failover is in progress. You will find the virtual machine VM2-test in virtual machines. Now the test failover has completed successfully. Let's go back to the virtual machines and see the status of this virtual machine. VM2 test is a virtual machine that we just failed over, test failover. Let's go to the, you can see some networking details here. Let's go to the boot diagnostics first to see the status of this machine. From the screenshot you can see that the login screen is available and the network is connected, so everything is fine. You can try to log into this machine. The other option to connect this machine is through remote desktop. You can connect it through public IP or from the other virtual machines in the same network. Let's connect it through Azure Bastion. Azure Bastion is as a connection option through web browser using 443. So let's do that. How to set up Azure Bastion was explained in the previous video. If you are new to Azure Bastion, you will find a link in the below description on how to configure Azure Bastion. So this is the easiest way, like you can easily access your virtual machines and you will have single sign-on capabilities and everything, and it is an enhanced RDP also. So we can see that the virtual machine has successfully spinned up in Azure virtual network. So let's go back to the migration vault and select replicated items. So we're gonna clean up this test failover. Cleanup will delete the test failover virtual machine and gonna prepare a planned failover. Let's click on the cleanup test failover. Then the testing was successful. So once you click testing is complete and delete the test failover virtual machines, this machine gonna removed from Azure Virtual Network, and then we can go for a planned failover. Let's wait to complete the test failover cleanup. Now that part has completed. Let's move back to the virtual machines and see that this virtual machine 2 has disappeared. So it's time to go for a planned failover. Go back to migration vault, then replicated items, then click on the virtual machine, then just select failover. This is going to be an actual failover. You have to plan to shut down your virtual machine in on-premises, and you have to plan to connect your users from your on-premises to the virtual machine in Azure. So this required some planning in DNS, in IP address and all, because you're going to use a separate IP address, and you have to think about the application dependencies, how it can be connected to this. So this actually you can try during the test failover. Once everything is successful, you can simply implement those in the final planned failover. You have an option to shut down the virtual machine during the beginning of the failover, so that the configuration server will handle to shut down the VMware virtual machines in on-premises and spin up your virtual machine in Azure. You can see that the virtual machine is shutting down automatically. Then it's gonna start failover of this virtual machine into Microsoft Azure. So if you are everything prepared for example with the DNS address and connectivity of users, application, whatever related to this machine, then the downtime is very few actually. And as I prepared a site-to-site VPN connectivity, all the users gonna connect to this. The only difference is the IP address is different, but if you are able to manage it with the DNS name, then there is no single drop going to happen if you did this with a good planning. Now the virtual machine is ready. Let's go back to the virtual machines and see the status of this virtual machine. Now you can see that it came as VM2 because this is a planned this is a failover, not a test failover. Go back to the boot diagnostics. This will help you to know like what is the status of this machine. It's coming up. And now you can see that the machine is fine, and you can see the network connectivity. You can confirm with Azure Bastion. You can confirm the connection from RDP from the other virtual machines in the same network, or you can use Bastion to connect it, or you can use public. You can assign public IP as we did in Hyper-V migration. Then you can try to connect it. So there are different ways you can try. One of the way to connect it to this machine. For us to know like the virtual machine migration is completed successfully, you can use Azure Bastion. That is the easiest way to connect it to the virtual machine, and that give you an enhanced experience. If you are new to Azure Bastion, I really recommend you to watch to go through the link that given in the description to understand how to configure it. So now the virtual machine is ready and it is working in Microsoft Azure. The next step, actually, you have opened RDP ports. You have assigned remote desktop access to some users as a part of preparing your virtual machines to move to Microsoft Azure. Now it is time to tune up to configure the network security group to control the virtual machines, the port access. You can and disable the RDP port if not required. So those things need to be done after migration. That are the post migration tasks. So that is all about Azure Site Recovery migration for VMware virtual machine to Microsoft Azure. Thank you for watching this video. In the coming video, we're going to see how to move on-premises workloads to Microsoft Azure. The only difference is how to set up the configuration server. And in that case, we're going to configure configuration server as a separate server in a Windows server. So thank you for watching. Subscribe my YouTube channel for more videos.